Hello everyone. We are going today to discuss a stepwise approach to diagnose abnormalities with echocardiography. And to reach this, I suggest a stepwise approach. Number one is to identify the view. Number two is to identify structures like heart chambers, valves, and big vessels. Number three is to identify the mode, and then finally to identify the pathology. Let's start by the first two, identifying the view and the cardiac structures. First of all, we shall go through the windows of echocardiography. We have four main windows: the apical window, the subcostal window, the parasternal window, and the suprasternal window. And we won't discuss that today, as it has a separate video for technical considerations in doing echocardiography. Let's start with the parasternal view. So in parasternal view, this is a video showing long axis of the heart, and this is a long parasternal long axis view. And this is a standstill image. And let's identify the structures together in this long parasternal view. In long parasternal view, this is the LV, and this is the left atrium. So this is the aorta, and this is the right ventricle. And this is the mitral valve, and this is the aortic valve. So these are the main structures shown in the long parasternal axis view. Notice that the parasternal window is a broad term. From this parasternal window, you can get multiple views. You can get long parasternal axis, and you can also get short axis view at multiple levels. This is long parasternal view showing the left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, right ventricle, and two valves, mitral valve and aortic valve. This is the short axis, and this is the short axis at the level of the papillary muscles. So this is the LV, and these are the papillary muscles that are attached to the mitral valve leaflets through chordae tendineae, and this is the RV. So this is the LV, and this is the RV, and this is the interventricular septum. So you should identify this view, the short axis, parasternal axis view. And this is a video showing short axis view, short parasternal axis too, but this is at the level of the mitral valve. So this is the mitral valve, and this is the LV, this is the RV, and this is the interventricular septum. And here you can identify that the mitral valve leaflets are mobile, and the opening is wide, and the commissures are open. What are the commissures? The commissures are the site of meeting of both leaflets. This leaflet, anterior leaflet, and the posterior leaflet, and this is the first commissure, and this is the second commissure. So here the commissures are widely open, as you can see. So this is the third level of short parasternal axis view at the level of great vessels. We went through the long parasternal axis view, and we went through the short axis view at the level of the papillary muscle and the mid cavity, and also we went through the short axis view at the level of the mitral valve. Notice that the level of the mitral valve coincides with the basal left ventricle, and the level of papillary muscle coincides with the mid cavity or mid segments of the LV wall, and we can also get the apical LV, but I won't go through this today, it's advanced. I want you to know that the short axis view also you can get by tilting the probe, you can get the level of the great vessels. So what you get in the middle of this view is the aortic valve with the classic Y sign or Mercedes sign. This is the aortic valve, and it here when it opens it gives a triangular opening. So this is a tricuspid valve. This is leaflet number 1, this is leaflet number 2, and this is leaflet number 3. And this is the interatrial septum separating the left atrium from the right atrium, and this is the tricuspid valve. So this is the RV, and then this is the RVOT, and the RVOT is meant the R ventricular means the right ventricular outflow tract. Then this is the pulmonary valve, this is the pulmonary artery. So let's revise the structures again in this short axis at the level of great vessels. This is the aortic valve, this is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, this is the interatrial septum, this is the tricuspid valve, this is the RV, right ventricle, this is the RVOT, right ventricular outflow tract, this is the tricuspid valve, and finally the pulmonary artery. Also by tilting your hand, you can get the pulmonary artery branching into two main right and left pulmonary arteries. After that, we go to the apical window. We said that the parasternal window, we can get multiple views, like the long parasternal axis view and the short parasternal axis view. And the short parasternal, we can get the level of the mitral valve, which coincides with the basal LV segments, and also the mid cavity between brackets, the papillary muscle, and the apical LV segments. And finally, we went through the short axis view at the level of the great vessels, showing the aorta and aortic valve and the pulmonary artery. Now we will go through the apical windows, and the apical window we can get multiple views also. The first of them is the apical 4-chamber view. The apical 4-chamber view. This is the probe lying at the apex, and what's anterior and what's closer to the probe appears above in the screen, and what's posterior and away from the probe appears below in the screen. So what's just inside, just below the probe in the apical 4-chamber view is the left ventricle. Posteriorly is the left atrium, and then the right atrium, and the RV. And this is the mitral valve, and this is the tricuspid valve. So this is the classical 4-chamber view of the heart. Again, this is the LV, this is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the interatrial septum, this is the interventricular septum, this is the mitral valve, and this is the tricuspid valve. This is apical 2-chamber view. Apical 2-chamber view is obtained by tilting the probe 90 degrees, and we get only the left atrium and the left ventricle, and this is the mitral valve. So this is the apical 2-chamber view. Then we get apical 3-chamber view. Apical 3-chamber view, this is the left atrium, and this is the aorta, this is the LV, and so this is the mitral valve, and this is the aortic valve. So after that, we go to identify the mode of the echo. Now we go to the basic echo modes. And first of all, I'm not going to explain the physics behind every mode, but I'm giving a hint about every mode. P mode, color Doppler, continuous wave Doppler, and the pulsed wave Doppler. These are the main, but not all, echo modes for your level to know. The P mode is the standard mode. When you put the probe, you just get this view. You don't get any other color or waves. You just get the anatomy and the structures in this manner. Then the color Doppler, and when you hear Doppler, this is concerned with the blood flow inside the heart across the valves if there is any shunting. So by identifying the color flow, you can identify if there is turbulence or not. In most of echocardiograms, when blood flow occurs towards the probe, don't forget the probe is here, and when the color flow is going towards the probe, like here from the mitral, from the left atrium to the LV through the mitral valve, it gives a red color. While if it is going away from the probe, like here, going to the aortic valve, from the LV to the aortic valve, then to the aorta, it gives a blue color. And if there is any turbulence, you can get multiple of colors, like red with green, with yellow, with blue. You can identify that there is plenty of colors occurring that can identify that this turbulent blood flow, indicating that there is stenosis or regurgitation or shunting of blood, as you will see later. Then the continuous wave Doppler. If you applied a continuous wave Doppler along, for example, the mitral valve, you can identify the basic flow. The basic flow of the mitral valve occurs from the left atrium to the left ventricle. So it occurs in this direction. And so this is the baseline. And regarding the mitral valve, you will see that the basic mitral valve flow is above this line because it's going from below to above. While the reverse occurs with the aortic valve. With the aortic valve, if you get a continuous wave across the aortic valve like this image, you get the flow from the LV to the aorta, which is from above to downward, and thus the flow appears here below the baseline. So if there is in the aortic valve flow above the baseline, means that there is blood going in the reverse direction, so it means this aortic regurgitation. And in the mitral valve, if you find some flow, some waves below the baseline, this means that there is mitral regurgitation. And also, you can get the maximum velocity across the valve. You know all that if any liquid is going through a stenotic segment, its velocity increases. So this can be translated that when you can put the continuous wave Doppler line across the valve opening, you can get the maximum velocity across the valve. And we have a certain readings regarding the maximum velocity for each valve, above which there is considered a stenosis. So this can aid us with the color Doppler to identify the valvular lesions like stenosis or regurgitation. Last but not least, the pulsed wave Doppler is different from the continuous wave Doppler. That the continuous wave Doppler gives the velocity, maximum velocity across the line. For example, if you put the continuous wave Doppler like this line is identified either by a line or a circle in most of echocardiograms. It gives the maximum velocity along this line. So if there is a stenosis here or a stenosis here, I can't decide. But it tells us that there is an increased velocity across the line. But the pulsed wave Doppler gives us an idea about the exact site of increased velocity. This line is defined by the presence of two parallel lines like this. And when you put this sample at the correct position, you get the instantaneous velocity and pressure at this point. Here you cannot decide where is the level of the stenosis. Here you put just the sample like this at the proper position to get an instantaneous velocity. And I'm not going through the pulsed wave Doppler very much during this lecture because it's somehow advanced, but I'd like you to know that to identify pulsed wave Doppler, you will find some plaqueness inside the wave. Okay, like here, you can see some plaque inside the waves. This we can identify also the pulsed wave from the shape of the sample in the B mode. If you can see this image, you can identify that there is a line has two perpendicular, two parallel lines perpendicular to this line. Okay, while the continuous wave Doppler, you see one line with a single marker in its mid. So the basic views we are going to discuss. Every view we will discuss the color Doppler and the continuous wave regarding the valves and the lesions we are going to see. And finally, after we went through the views and the cardiac structures and we know the echo modes, we are going finally to identify the pathology we are having in our study. Before we are going to discuss any pathology, I'd like to remember that any problem with the heart has something to do with either the myocardium or the pericardium or the endocardium, or basically the heart chambers themselves, or the great vessels like the aorta and the pulmonary artery, or some congenital defects. So any problem will be classified as a problem of myocardium, pericardium, endocardium, or heart valves. Heart chambers, including cardiac masses, great vessels, congenital heart disease, and structural. Let's start by problems with the heart chambers. I'd like to present the normal apical four chamber view always in front of you. So this is the normal apical four chamber view. Remember, this is the left ventricle, this is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. And you can comment and compare between like this image and this image. And if you focus, you will find that the LV here is dilated. So the first impression you can get is dilated LV. Again, when you get an image like this, identify the basic structures you have. This is the probe, okay, this is the LV, this is the left atrium, this is the mitral valve, this is the interventricular septum, and this is the intra-atrial septum. And what can you observe here? That there is marked dilatation of the right ventricle and the right atrium. And you can always compare with the normal on the upper left side. This is the marked dilatation of the right side, the RV, and the right atrium. The third example we have, again, when you see an image like this, four chamber, this is the four chamber view of the heart. This is basically the LV. This is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. And what can you see here? The marked dilatation of both atria. These are marked dilated, they are even larger than the ventricles themselves. And this is an example for dilated both atria. Then we go for cardiac masses. And what I need you to know or to observe is the presence of a cardiac mass. So any strange structure inside the heart chambers, you can identify as cardiac mass for more investigation to do and for differential diagnosis. I'm not asking you to know the diagnosis, but only to observe if there is an abnormal mass inside the cardiac chambers. And starting with, this is also an apical four-chamber view of the heart. This is the LV, okay, and you can observe here the presence of abnormal structures inside the LV. This is for differential diagnosis. Mostly will be a cardiac thrombus, LV apical thrombus, but I need you to just to say that there is abnormal mass inside the LV, okay, and it is attached to the apical segments. So what is this view? If you remember, this is the long parasternal view, this is the LV, this is the RV, this is the interventricular septum, this is the left atrium, and this is the aorta. This is the aortic valve, and this is the mitral valve. And what can you observe here is the presence of a huge mass. This huge mass is going through the mitral valve, and it's very easy to diagnose. And it's probably a cardiac myxoma, but I don't need you to say the diagnosis. I just need you to say that there is an abnormal mass, and to know the differential diagnosis for masses in this place, like vegetation, thrombus. You have to know the differential diagnosis in order to think properly and think how to investigate more regarding the diagnosis. Then we go to problems regarding the myocardium. And let's start with the LV hypertrophy. After you saw the normal looking of the myocardium in the short axis view, here you can notice the presence of significant LV hypertrophy, and this is concentric, taking all over the circumference of the LV. And remember, this is the short axis view at the level of the mitral valve leaflets. This is the mitral valve, and this is a severe LV hypertrophy. This is even a more severe form of LV hypertrophy. You can see here that the cavity is very small, and this very severe LV hypertrophy, again, this is a short axis view at the level of papillary muscles. You can see here the papillary muscles. Regarding also the myocardium, you have to look for the LV ejection fraction and wall motion abnormalities. And just to remind you of the basic anatomy, this is the LV, and this is the interventricular septum. It's called here in the apical four-chamber view, it's called the emphysoseptum. And this is the anterolateral wall. Also in the apical four-chamber view, it's called the anterolateral wall. In additional views, like the apical two-chamber and apical three-chamber, we get more walls to see. I'm not going also through this today, but I want you to know that in every specific view, you get different walls of the heart. So you can comment on all walls of the heart from multiple views, not only from one view. And by this, you can comment on the regional motion abnormalities. What is the region? What does the regional motion abnormalities mean? You know that every coronary artery, left main or right coronary artery, and left main branching into the LAD and left circumflex gives a blood supply to a specific region in the myocardium. So if one of these arteries is obstructed or stenosis occurred in one of them, then the blood supply going to this particular area will be affected, and this region becomes ischemic. So it may be akinetic with no contractility at all, or hypokinetic with little contractility. So this means that you shall observe the wall motion for every segment of the myocardium and comment about the regional wall motion abnormalities and comment about the ejection fraction overall. So for example, if you get this emphysoseptal wall, we shall classify it into basal infroseptal, mid infroseptal, and this is called the epicoseptal. Similarly, with the anterolateral wall, this is the basal anterolateral, this is the mid anterolateral, and this is the epicolateral. So we will comment on every segment of these regarding the contractility. And what meant by contractility is that you observe the thickening that occurs in the myocardium. Here the myocardium thickens, and also the inward motion of the myocardium. You shall comment on both. So if those are evident, you say that is a normal kinesis of the myocardium or normal wall motion. Ejection fraction can be obtained by many methods, but if there is significant regional motion abnormalities, the best method is to obtain by Simpson method. You trace the myocardium in the end diastole, and then you trace the myocardium in the end systole, and by entering this data on the echo, it gives you the stroke volume, which is the difference between the two, and then you can also see the ejection fraction calculated by the echo, which is the end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume over the end diastolic volume. This is the calculated ejection fraction. And there is Pipe-Lane Simpson that you can trace the end diastolic and end systolic volumes in both apical 4-chamber view and apical 2-chamber view. This is to maximize the sensitivity and the specificity for your measurements, so that it be more accurate and more representable of the real cardiac function, not to obtain it in one view only. After you see these normal images, I'd like you to comment on the first video we have. This is again the LV, this is the infroseptal, and this is the anterolateral. And surely we can observe here that the basal and mid segments of the infroseptal wall are kinetic. They are thinned out, they are not contracting at all, while there is hypokinesis in the epicoseptal region and in the basal and mid anterolateral. And the best moving here is the epicolateral. This is the most spirit part in this diagram. So there is significant regional motion abnormalities, and apparently it's very evident that the ejection fraction here is low. The contractility here is not very good. This is another example. This is also an apical 4-chamber view, and you can observe here that the contractility in the anterolateral is not bad, and the basal and mid segments is also not bad, but there is akinesis of the epicoseptal, and this is called the apical cap. So, and the apical cap and the epicoseptal segments, and this signifies also a presence of significant regional motion abnormalities. This part is akinetic. It's not contracting at all. It's not thickening, and it's not going inward. This is akinetic. This is the third image. You can also observe that the LV is markedly dilated, and here you can see that the whole LV is not contracting very well. Okay, this is a global hypokinesia, which means that all the segments and all the territories are contracting the same, and they are poorly contracting. So this goes with mostly with a dilated cardiomyopathy more than ischemic cardiomyopathy, because if it was ischemic, it will affect some parts more than others. But here the affection is very global, and there is severe global hypokinesia, and evident that the ejection fraction here is very low. Another function of the echo is good to do that, to get to know the LV diastolic function, and it's advanced. I'm not going through this today, but it's very important to diagnose those with LV diastolic function even in the presence of normal systolic function, because of the new terms for heart failure with preserved ejection fraction and the evolving term of HFpEF. You have to diagnose the LV diastolic dysfunction very well, and to proceed with the investigations after diagnosis and treat accordingly. So it's very important, but I'm not going through this item in this video. Next, we go to the heart valves, and you know that heart valves are part of the endocardium. So we went through the cardiac chambers, then we went through the myocardium, and now we are going through the endocardium and basically the heart valves. In the upper left images, we can see the aortic valve. You can see aortic valve here in the parasternal long axis view. It's called parasternal long axis view for shortening plaques. And in the short axis view, parasternal short axis view, okay, the see this sign when closing and triangular opening when it is open. And this is the normal appearance of the aortic valve. Okay. Here you can see that the aortic valve is severely calcific and stenosis and stenotic, and from the first impression you see that yes, this aortic valve is not opening very well. It must be stenotic, and so I have to search for the degree of stenosis accurately. Again, in this view, this is the short axis view, and comparing it to this view, you can easily identify that the opening here of the aortic valve is small, and this is calcific, also aortic stenosis, and you have to identify the severity of the aortic stenosis. So this is the first mode in identifying the aortic stenosis, which is the normal P mode, okay, without applying any additional echo modes. But the assessment for aortic valve stenosis not only including the P mode. We shall discuss also the continuous wave across the stenotic valve in the apical 5-chamber view. And as we said before, the continuous waves Doppler aids us with the maximum velocity obtained along this line. So if you put the line correctly along the opening of the aortic valve and across the maximum flow of the valve, you can get a very high velocity. You can see here the maximum velocity is 4.4. And if it is more than 2.5, it's mild stenosis. If more than 3, it's moderate stenosis. If more than 4, it's severe stenosis. And you can also get the maximum gradient and also get the mean gradient. You can get the mean gradient by tracing this envelope. You can trace this envelope and get the mean pressure gradient. And you can obtain the maximum velocity by obtaining this point, the apex of the envelope. This is translated to the maximum velocity across the aortic valve. So basically, this is the important thing to know in the aortic stenosis is the continuous wave Doppler across the aortic valve. Finally, in the assessment of the aortic valve, you have to assess the aortic valve area. And area here is obtained by something called the continuity equation. I'm not going through the advanced tips and tricks regarding the calculations for the aortic valve area, but it also includes the Balto wave Doppler in the LVOT, which is called the left ventricular outflow tract across the aortic, across the exit of the LV into the aorta. Second example we are going to have is the mitral valve stenosis. And again, I remind you that the mitral valve opening is very evident here in the parasternal long axis view. This is the mitral valve, and the parasternal short axis view in the level of the mitral leaflets. This is the mitral valve. You shall comment on the mitral valve leaflet thickening, measures are fused or not, the chordae tendineae of the subvalvular apparatus like the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles, if there is any calcification, the mobility of the leaflets. And the most common cause of mitral stenosis is rheumatic heart disease, and you can identify here the presence of the classical hockey stick sign of the mitral rheumatic mitral stenosis. The movement of the mitral leaflets mainly from the base, and so you can see this, the opening is stenotic, and the movements mainly from the basal leaflet, not from the tip, which is restricted. And you can identify here also the left atrium is dilated as a response for the mitral stenosis. So this is by P mode. You can get also the short axis view like this view, and you can identify here that the commissures here are closed. This is closed commissures, and the mitral valve opening is very small, like the fish mouth appearance, classical of rheumatic mitral stenosis, and this is classical for severe rheumatic mitral stenosis, also from the P mode. While by obtaining color Doppler, you can see here the aliasing or the turbulence I'm talking about. This is the turbulence flow. It should be red in this direction, blue in this direction, going to the aorta. But here you can see the turbulent blood flow and plenty of colors in the direction of the emptying of the blood from the left atrium to the LV. So the turbulence occurs in this direction, mean the valve is stenotic. If the turbulence occurs in the reverse direction, this means that there is a regurgitation here. But in this direction, from the LV to the from the left atrium to the LV, means there is turbulence in the LV due to mitral stenosis. Regarding the continuous wave, and when we put the continuous wave Doppler line across the maximal flow of the aorta of the mitral valve, you can see that there is a pretty good, well-identified envelope above the baseline because it occurs the direction from the below upwards, from the turbulence occur from the direction from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and so this is reflected above the baseline. And by tracing the envelope here, you can get the mean gradient, and when the mean gradient is more than 10, it reflects severe mitral stenosis in the presence of optimal conditions, that his heart rate is normal, there is no associated mitral regurgitation or associated lesions or abnormal cardiac function. And also we can calculate the mitral valve area by obtaining the pressure half-time method. This is one method to obtain the area through, and the other more accurate method is to do 2D planimetry by tracing the mitral valve opening in the short axis view. When you get the short axis view and the fish mouth appearance, just trace the opening of the mitral valve and get the calculated area by planimetry. This is another example for continuous wave, but here the patient is in atrial fibrillation, so the waves are not the same, and you shall obtain from 5 to 10 separate measurements and obtain the average from all of these readings to obtain the mean pressure gradient. The next example we are going to have is the mitral regurgitation, and here is the parasternal long axis view. In the parasternal long axis view, you can identify the turbulent blood flow occurring in the left atrium and filling all of the left atrium, and this signifies the severe mitral regurgitation. You can quantify also the mitral regurgitation by measuring the vena contracta by measuring the width of the turbulent blood flow in the parasternal axis view, and if it's more than 0.7, this means that there is severe mitral stenosis. This is one method to quantify the mitral regurgitation. Otherwise, you have to comment on the mitral regurgitation severity by the color Doppler. And this is another example also of severe mitral regurgitation, and it is reaching the posterior wall of the left atrium. So this is a severe mitral regurgitation, and notice also here the presence of global hypokinesia of the LV. The LV is not contracting very well, and so thus it may be functional mitral regurgitation due to the dilatation of the annulus, due to the left ventricular dilatation and dysfunction. Another example of mitral regurgitation specifically seen in the cases of mitral valve prolapse, what is called mitral valve prolapse. And mitral valve prolapse means the prolapse of the body of the mitral leaflet, one or both, into the left atrium during the systole. As you can see here, cup-shaped prolapse. And these lead to, if there is single leaflet prolapse, it leads to eccentric regurgitation in the other side. So there is here it's a posteriorly directed regurgitation due to the presence of anterior leaflet prolapse. This is a case of aortic stenosis, a mixed aortic stenosis and regurgitation, and you can see here the regurgitation in this direction and the turbulent blood flow in this direction, meaning that this patient has mixed aortic regurgitation and aortic stenosis. Another examples to look for regarding the heart valves here is the mitral ring, which is a hyperechoic band seen in the level of the mitral valve done in cases of functional dilatation of the annulus, functional mitral regurgitation and dilatation of the annulus done for cases of mitral regurgitation. Another something to look for is the presence of a prosthetic mitral valve or prosthetic valve generally, and there are two types of prosthesis: mechanical valve or pyoprosthesis or tissue valve. Mechanical valve, we will see that there is reverberations from the metal of the valve inside the, for example, the left atrium if it's mitral prosthesis. And here you can identify, this is the prosthesis and it is the reverberations from the metal of the mitral valve prosthesis. And you can see here the presence of a small mass that needs to be more investigated by transesophageal echo for possibility of thrombus or vegetation. It will be more evident in the transesophageal echo. Again, this is a huge mass on the mechanical mitral prosthesis. And how did you know that it's mechanical? Yes, from the reverberations inside the left atrium from the metal of the mitral prosthesis. And this is mostly thrombus or vegetations according to the clinical scenario and according to the transesophageal echo data. This is an example for bioprosthesis, and you can identify the bioprosthesis simply by noticing the stents. These are two stents for the bioprosthetic valve. Every bioprosthetic valve has a stent, two stents, and a tissue valve. Tissue valve is either porcine or bovine, and you can notice here that there is two stents standing here with no reverberations inside the left atrium. This means that this is a tissue valve or bioprosthetic valve. In this example, you can see that there is a mechanical valve prosthesis dehiscence, and dehiscence means that more than 60% of the circumference of the annulus of the new mechanical valve separated due to infection most commonly, and this led to that the mechanical valve is having a rocking movement and it's not stable at its position. So it has a rocking movement and it's not stable at its position, and this is called valve prosthesis dehiscence and occurs in cases of infective endocarditis attacking the sutures of the valve to the annulus of the tissue. Let's now go to problems regarding the pericardium, and this is an example for pericardial effusion surrounding the heart. It is all of this is pericardial effusion related to the lateral surface and the anterior surface of the heart, also the posterior surface of the heart. And again, this is another example. And this is a posterior pericardial effusion. This is varicella longa axis view. And an important tip to identify the pericardial effusion from the neighboring pleural effusion is the relation to the descending aorta. So if the effusion is anterior to the descending aorta in the parasternal axis view, then it is pericardial. If it's behind or posterior to the descending aorta, it is pleural effusion. This is another example for pericardial effusion. It's anterior for the descending aorta, so this is pericardial effusion. This is the black space behind the LV is pericardial effusion. This is an example for swinging heart in cases of large pericardial effusion and right atrial collapse. There is right atrial collapse due to the large amount of effusion, and notice the swinging heart in the large pericardial effusion and impending tamponade. What about the echo signs of tamponade? Tamponade means that the fluid surrounding the heart accumulates very rapidly, that it's tamponading the heart, and it first decompresses the atria because of the very thin wall, followed by the right ventricle and the right ventricular outflow tract collapse, because also it's thin-walled, and very rarely it leads to collapse of the LV because of the pressures and the good muscle power of the LV. So the hemodynamics effects comes from the hemodynamic effects of the tamponade comes from the RV collapse and underfilling of the LV, and these are some of the signs obtained in pericardial tamponade. Another pathology we shall notice here is the problems with the ascending aorta. And here you can identify the presence of normal aorta. This is the normal aortic valve, and this is the normal ascending aorta. This is normal reference. Here you can identify the presence of aortic dilatation in the previous image, and this is also a reference method to identify the normal measurements obtained. This is the normal measurement for the ascending aorta. This is the normal measurement for the aortic root. The bisinus, this is the sinus of Valsalva. So this is a measurement called bisinus measurement. This is sinotubular. This is the part that attaches the sinus of the aorta to the tubular ascending aorta, so it's called the sinotubular junction. This is the second measurement. And the third measurement that was obtained during systole, the only measurement obtained during the mid-systole, is the annulus measurement occurring from the site of attachment of both aortic leaflets. So those are basically the three measurements for the aortic root: the aortic annulus during the mid-systole, and the pi sinus and the sinotubular junction during the diastole, and also the measurement for the ascending aorta. Another example for pathology regarding the aorta is the presence of dissection, and here you can identify the presence of a dissection flap. This is a parasternal long axis view, and this is the dissection flap with, this is true lumen and this is the false lumen. This is another example of markedly dilated ascending aorta. This is a parasternal long axis view also, and this is the aortic valve, and this is a dissection flap. You can see dissection flap in any direction, because this is a 2D measurement or 2D view of the heart. So here the dissection flap is seen in this direction, and another views you can see the dissection flap like this. The more importantly that you can identify the dissection flap in order to order a CT aortography for the patient to prevent the lethal complications of the aortic dissection. And this is another example for aortic dissection in the ascending aorta. You must know that dissection not necessarily necessitating that the aorta is dilated. You may see a normal ascending aorta, but there is a dissection flap. So not necessarily that the ascending aorta must be dilated in order to search for a dissection flap. Always search for a dissection flap if the clinical context is demanding. Last but not least, I'm going to show you an image for congenital defects and congenital shunting. And for example, this is a ventricular septal shunt. Mostly this occurs not necessarily occurring congenital. I'm giving you an example for cardiac shunting, but shunting occurs also if there is ventricular septal rupture, like in this case. if the patient is ischemic and the septum is severely thinned out due to myocardial infarction, and it then get ruptured. So ventricular septal rupture may occur due to ischemia or may occur congenital, and this is an example for shunting that can be diagnosed by color Doppler and maybe also by continuous wave Doppler. So I hope that you find this lecture useful, and these are the basics to understand echo images. I hope that you identify the cardiac structures very well, identify the basic pathologies, and get familiar with some echo views and echo problems. And till we meet in another lectures, thank you.